Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolutions Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on November 3rd, 2022 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. So first, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. And from there, you can scroll down the page and you'll see the most recent show listed, and or you can search the archived listings for past shows that you may have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. Now, the show drops every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen to it live or any time. And while you're there, don't miss the opportunity to download your free How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy document, which is a PDF of friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer and one of my major mentors, Stephen Forrest, which, is a short summary about what each of us need depending on our specific sun sign to be happy. So don't miss that opportunity. It's like I said, grab it when you listen to this podcast or, whether you do so live or after the fact. And please enjoy some of Stephen's astrological words of wisdom. Now, separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul. And that's where you can keep track of upcoming podcasts, content, and other astro news you can use. I'm also posting on Instagram now as well under Karmic Evolution, so feel free to follow me there. I want to mention, before I get into this week's astro news you can use, also that I was a guest on astrologer Jackie Slevin's new YouTube show called Planet Speak. And we covered some interesting topics. We covered Mars retrograde, we covered the upcoming eclipse, and we looked at the charts of Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen, who obviously recently just got divorced, and where the eclipses are hitting them. So we had a nice, interesting discussion all around, but particularly on that topic too, for those who are interested. So I urge you to check it out on YouTube. It is under the Bold Brave TV network, and on that network, Jackie's show is Planet Speak. So feel free to have a listen. And finally, I'm offering still my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading to listeners only for $99. So if you're interested in astrology, want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, then, by all means, have a look at this reading. And that's because it can be tremendously helpful if you want to gain greater consciousness about why you're here, what's your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime. An astrology reading of this sort can quickly help you move from chaos to clarity and discern what might actually be holding you back based on soul conditioning from the past, be it early in this lifetime or during past lives, in areas that are of importance, which would be relationships, career, finances, and or health. So again, a natal chart reading, a karmic evolution natal insight chart reading can lead to the understanding of how to heal old karmic wounds and to move forward by helping you to co-create your own future happiness and success through astrological insight. So that's easy, as I like to say, when you take advantage of Karmic Evolution's $99 discounted 1-hour Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading, which again is for listeners only. Now, full disclosure, I did make that offer to Jackie's peeps too, but they're the only other ones. I do not advertise this particular reading, and I am raising the price for people who are not listeners or not part of a show onto which I am invited to participate. Now, again, at almost half the regular price, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. And you can find easy access to this offer on my website at karmicevolution.com/karmic99. So hit me up today. Okay, so now let's get into this week's Astro news you can use. As many of you know, we're smack in the middle of eclipse season now, with only a few days until the November 8th Taurus full moon lunar eclipse. Actually, it's scary how few days. I think he said 5 days or something. Anyway, it's next Tuesday. Today is Thursday, so you can take out your calendar and count the days. But and by now, it's my hope that we've understood that the meaning of the October 25th solar eclipse in Scorpio was to reinforce for each of us, or to each of us, how powerful we really are and how powerful we can really be, especially when we stand together with others. Now, it occurs to me there's a bit of a dichotomy in making that statement, because later on I'm going to talk about individuation. But bear with me, because I think you'll understand the context that this is presented in. So now, remember, I've told you previously on previous podcasts that the energetic themes of eclipses tend to rise into consciousness approximately 3 weeks prior to the exact lunation. And this Taurus full moon lunar eclipse, which happens at 16 degrees Taurus at 3:01 a.m. Pacific time and 6:01 a.m. Eastern, calls us toward even greater self-empowerment. And here I'm speaking both on a personal and a collective level, by exposing our deepest, darkest fears into the light, and thereby helping us to release the unconscious hold they may have over us. In short, the November 8th Taurus full moon lunar eclipse finishes what the Scorpio new moon solar eclipse of October 25th started, which is to bring a deeper understanding into our consciousness that if we can trust and be loyal to ourselves, then we can find it far easier to determine who we can trust to really have our back in times of duress. Meanwhile, we know that Mars stationed retrograde at 25 degrees and 36 minutes of Gemini on October 30th, and astrologers know that often stations of planets, both whether they station retrograde or direct, tend to show up in the collective in some obvious way or ways. And so it was hard to miss the news around that time, October 30th, October 31st, just following the exact station. It was hard to miss the news, is what I'm trying to say. And I've already mentioned on past podcasts the growing angry rhetoric since Mars entered Gemini, particularly related to Gemini themes and issues such as education and the growing early childhood education, and the growing call by right-wingers to ban books in schools that they've determined would be a bad influence. Remember, Gemini is about our perspective, right? These books would be a bad influence on their children. So extremists have even mimicked Nazi propaganda backing the burning of books. Now, likewise, the ramped up political rhetoric advocating violence, which didn't begin with, but certainly was exacerbated by and made to seem more acceptable under the Trump administration, finally exploded into the collective, at least here in the U.S., with the attack on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband that left him with a fractured skull and a wounded hand and arm. I believe it was his right hand and arm requiring surgery. Now, we learned earlier this week that the perpetrator told police he was waiting for Nancy Pelosi so that he could smash her knees, which would cause her to return to Congress in a wheelchair to illustrate to her colleagues and the entire rest of the world her level of disempowerment. Now, in medical astrology, Saturn represents knees. It is the principle of that which will not bend will break. So what this guy was attempting to literally do was to bring her to her knees, force her to go down on bended knee, which, given that it's Scorpio season, means disempowering her ability to bow down, in his mind, to the political party with which this particular conspiracy theorist disagrees. And I'm putting that mildly, right? And by association, he sought to disempower and or disable the person who's third in line for the U.S. presidency. And that's if something should happen to incapacitate both the current president and the current vice president, because U.S. law says it's the Speaker of the House of Representatives who take the helm of the current administration, should, again, they meet their demise or become incapacitated, be in a coma, as a result of an accident, whatever, or an assassination attempt. And this guy was planning on doing that by weakening her physically, which becomes a metaphor for weakening her status in Congress as an ally of the current administration's party and her constituents and Democrats in general. And while this story dominated the airwaves in the U.S. and in some places around the world too last week, let's not forget other incidents that occurred at the station of Mars retrograde in Gemini, such as how 154 people, including 2 American college students, were killed in a deadly stampede during a Halloween celebration in Seoul, South Korea's diverse Itaewon, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so forgive me, Itaewon neighborhood, which according to the New York Times, and I quote here, has long served as a prized haven for those who are different. So let's remember now what the Mars planetary archetype represents: motivation, ambition, male sexuality, and assertion. And that's all in their normal ranges, right? As I said on Jackie's show yesterday, without Mars, we never get out of bed in the morning. Gives us a reason, it motivates us to get up and be physically active. But when taken to its extreme, the Mars archetype can cause over-assertiveness, over-aggression, hypersexuality, and potentially violence. Meanwhile, the Geminian zodiacal archetype represents, of course, communication. It represents youth, as in early childhood education, which traditionally at this point in time means preschool through high school. Local areas, such as your near neighborhood, the hood, transportation, particularly local, and all things that come in pairs, such as hands, feet, legs, sides of the brain, and most resonantly, since Gemini's an air sign, the lungs. So we have young people who are motivated to gather socially, Gemini is extremely social archetypal energy, in a local area as a group on All Hallows Eve, a pagan holiday marked by the thinning of the veil between this world and that of the dead. There's an irony there. There's a scorpionic resonance there. Gets shoved forward into a narrow alleyway from whose restrictive walls there is no escape. According to the British publication The Guardian, and here I quote, "The tiny alleyways of the Itaewon nightlife district drew as many as 100,000 people on Saturday night," local news media reported. "The throngs of people and tiny places were the perfect combination for a crowd crush, where the most common cause of injury and death is compressive asphyxia, or when people's airways become constricted from pushing against one another." End quote. And another terrible story that happened at approximately the same time as Mars station is that a bridge, and remember, there's a duality inherent in the Geminian archetype, and the travel component, so people who are motivated to cross a bridge from one side to the other, and that particular bridge happened to be a major tourist attraction in the city of Gujarat, India. Again, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Collapsed suddenly, plunging to their death 132 out of the 350 reportedly on or near the bridge at that time, the majority of which were women, children, and elderly people. So again, you can see the Mars and the Geminian themes inherent in some, sudden event that resulted from it. Well, supposedly this bridge was repaired, had been under construction for 4 months, and this was a reopening. So again, if it's a tourist attraction, it probably drew more people than normally it would on its reopening. Now, other big stories to hit the news this past week as Mars approached and or made his station included, quote, violent rhetoric designed to make you angry so that you then find someone to blame, as one political pundit put it. Now, and I'm going to mention this now and get back to it. I am going to, sorry. All right, discombobulated early, Sheri? Yeah, maybe. Okay, so violent rhetoric designed to make you angry so that you then find someone to blame. And I'm relating this to both the statements and actions of Kanye West and NBA All-Star Brooklyn Nets basketball player Kyrie Irving on the subject of anti-Semitism, which just happened to occur as Israel voted on whether, essentially, and I'm boiling this all down, right, whether or not it's a Jewish state first and a democracy second, or a democracy at all. Now, we can, inherent in that latter part of my statement is a rhyme of the energy going on here in the United States. However, I do remember, as I believe I previously mentioned on a past podcast, that Israel's chart, which I looked up, and it's May 14th, 1948 at 4 p.m. in Tel Aviv, Israel, has a first house Scorpio South Node. That gives it some martial flavor because the first house is naturally ruled by Mars, Aries. And the South Node of Israel is at 13 degrees and 41 minutes of Scorpio. It's also flanked by wounded healer Chiron at 21 degrees and 24 minutes of Scorpio, and both are squared by a 10th house Pluto Saturn conjunction from 12 degrees and 38 minutes and 16 degrees 25 minutes of Leo, respectively. Now, what's interesting about that is that the transiting karmic South Node is today at 1324 Scorpio, indicating that Israel's currently experiencing a nodal return. And because nodal returns happen not just for all of us, but for nations too, every 18 and a half years, and because the nodes in charts, whether they're ours or indicative of a nation's birth, are always representative of relationship. And that's by virtue of the fact that there are oppositions, which means they always carry an I versus thee flavor. Often nodal returns, as well as half returns and half the 18.5 years, which is 9 1/4, right, provide us a time to make changes to our relationships. Now, sometimes we do this willingly, and other times it's forced on us. Now, the good news for Israel is that a nodal return means not only has the transiting South Node met up with its natal South Node, in Scorpio in this case, but the same is happening for its Taurus North Node in the 7th house. And the whole point of this nodal structure for Israel, just as it is with the wider collective, because the nodes are in the exact same signs in the sky right now, right, is that it must release any demons and dragons inherent in the collective unconscious of its population in order to move toward the peace, serenity, and harmony promised by its 7th house Taurus North Node. However, with a Libra rising and Mars-ruled 7th house combined with Chiron on its South Node, indicating it was born from a karmic past of painful wounds, and given its current election, which has seemingly put Benjamin Netanyahu back in charge, at least for now, if he can form a working coalition, Libra rising, remember? The question becomes whether or not Israel can give up its persecution complex so as to stop drawing to it perpetrators or persecutors. Now, before anyone gets himself in a huff, let me say I am a Jew, born and raised Jewish, but I'm not a Zionist. And as an astrologer, I believe strongly that the shadow carried by Israel's natal Scorpio South Node and exacerbated by Chiron's proximity, and both of them in a fixed sign, the nodes are in fixed signs, that the Leo, Pluto, and Saturn squaring the nodes, which represents something that vexed the nation, during probably leading to its formation, in the form of the powers that be, because that Saturn Pluto is in the 10th house, which is Saturn ruled naturally, right? So they may have gotten a lot of opposition and needed to be accepted in order to build its reputation out in the world, right? But what I'm saying here is that I believe that the shadow, as I said, carried by its natal Scorpio South Node and exacerbated by Chiron's proximity to it, and in a fixed sign, prevents it from forgetting, yes, but also from forgiving. We know that one of Israel's slogan, because it was formed out of the Holocaust of World War II, is never again. Got no issue with that. But it's the forgiveness part that I think is important. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute too. And so on a psychological level, and yes, according to Jungian astrologer Liz Green in her book, The Outer Planets and Their Cycles, The Astrology of the Collective, she points out that, and I quote here, the outer planets are deeply significant representatives of the collective operating within the individual's life framework, and they perform like a force of fate, blind, compulsive, overwhelming, and often destructive, unless the ego can develop enough insight to distinguish itself from the collective currents of which it is part. And Green also quotes Carl Jung's collected works, in which he wrote, and here I quote again, "In these circumstances, the immunizing of the individual against the toxin of the mass psyche is the only thing that can help." End quote. Now that sounds like the process of individuation to me. So this is a rabbit hole I actually did not intend to go down today, but the mind works the way the mind works. So suffice it to say that these quotes become particularly relevant against the backdrop of this upcoming November 8th Taurus full moon lunar eclipse, because as the October 25th solar eclipse asked us, as I said, to dig deep within, to bring into the light stuff like repressed unconscious prejudices, hatreds, jealousies, covetousness, etc., which when hidden from the conscious portion of our psyches gets projected out and thrown back to us in the form of hatred, jealousy, prejudice, etc. of others. And in that way, because these repressed unconscious prejudices, etc., disempower us over the long term, this set of eclipses is trying to bring into consciousness that if we can, again, bring these into the light and dispel their power over us, we become empowered. And in doing so, we can then, as I said at the beginning, decide that we can trust ourselves instead of, as Liz Green says, getting, coerced into the currents of the modern, the unconscious portion of the collective. So my reference now to Israel is not only because of its current election cycle, but in the wake of Kanye West, I told you I'd get to it, recent announcement that he's going, and I quote, going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, and Kyrie Irving's recent social media post to which he attached an anti-Semitic propagandist movie, which I believe claims to be a documentary, which within it reportedly quotes Hitler approvingly, that this has created quite a backlash, right? So I get that the concept of what I'm saying is terribly difficult to grasp, but what we're not fully consciously cognizant of is extremely hard to reconcile with our conscious ego, which tends to believe only that which it can see, hear, taste, touch, and feel. So anything not verifiable by our five senses can be rationalized or poo-pooed away. So what I'm attempting to do here is to illustrate how the collective unconscious, unaware of its hidden biases, prejudices, etc., so easily takes the bait when rallied, or the collective unconscious, I'm saying. So people in, that make up, all of us are individuals and we make up part of the collective unconsciousness, and it's easy for us to take the bait when we're rallied by the call of those who manage to tap into such energies and make personal use of them in order to gain greater power over us, the very people they're trying to seduce by using their own prejudices or our own prejudices against us. So, and I went into this in greater detail, and I read a lot from Aaron Sullivan's take on this, the Jungian astrologer. But Mars retrograde now in Gemini until January 12th, 2023, calls us to find our inner warrior. I've said this several times now. So what is that really about? What's that mean in practical terms? Well, because again, we're in eclipse season with heavy-duty Scorpio Taurus energies, and because we're still under the influence of what I have begun to call hysteria, triggered back on April 12th when Jupiter conjoined with Neptune in Pisces for the first time in 166 years. And those of you who listen regularly know I've spoken about this on past podcasts, so please, by all means, feel free to go back and listen to them. And because Jupiter is or represents expansion, and Neptune is the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion, as is Pisces, under both Jupiter's traditional and Neptune's modern rulerships, we've got a recipe for the dissolution of boundaries between what's true and what's not. I'd mentioned before last week too, I believe, and I talked about this on Jackie's show yesterday, the dissolution of boundaries related to issues related to Jupiterian themes. Immigration, travel across borders, higher education. We just had the Supreme Court hear a case against Harvard and I think it was the University of North Carolina that seeks to abolish affirmative action. We have law. I mean, this is part of that, right? Law. The Supreme Court is going to probably gut affirmative action and several other things that are on the docket that we won't even know about until next June when they come down with their decisions. But, the inability to see the reality versus the things that they pigeonhole to look at. I read an article out of The Nation. I love Elie Mystal, who's one of their judicial writers, or if not the one, who wrote about the arguments made the other day in front of the Supreme Court. And one of the things that he said is that arguments made on behalf of Asian students who brought the suit, I'm not sure if it was against both Harvard and the UNC or whether it was just the North Carolina case, but that their case was backed by right-wingers who want to abolish and have worked for a long time to abolish affirmative action as part of U.S. law. And so what he said was that if they win this case and affirmative action is abolished under the guise of lawsuits that say it discriminates against Asian students, is that they won't reduce the the deciding of the case in favor of the plaintiffs is that it won't reduce prejudice. It won't reduce their. Okay, hang on. I'm sorry. I love to talk about law. Can you tell? I get tongue-tied. Instead of achieving its goal of making it easier for those who brought the case in the first place to gain admission to places like Harvard and the University of North Carolina, it will in fact end up not doing anything for them at all. And what Mistel pointed out in his article is that's because the case was taken up by people who want the abolishment of affirmative action and do not care at all who it disenfranchises. So they're actually working against their own defendants, but they don't realize it. Okay, you can't find anything more Jupiterian, Neptunian than that, I think. So keep your eyeballs peeled for those of you who either are lawyers or who are interested in legal topics to, during this period, look for more dissolution on this level. Now, when I talk about Jupiter-Neptune and its conjunction negatively, okay, I'm not talking about what's true about it metaphysically, and I made this point last week too, but those who've reached the level of understanding symbols and signs and have become more confident about their meaning and purpose in their lives may well enhance these capabilities now that Jupiter's retrograded back into Pisces, and until he stations direct there on November 23rd and then re-enters Aries on December 21st. So your abilities may be heightened, right? And that's a great thing. It's also a hugely creative time because when we tap into the energies of our higher self and hear our authentic voice, whether we believe that's religiously derived or just believe in universal energies, doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is it's not all negative. I'm just pointing out what's going on and showing you through these podcasts how the energies manifest in the collective and how they may filter down to us in our individual lives. So, meanwhile, in addition to the Jupiter-Neptune and Jupiter's retrograde back into Pisces now, where he is, of course, not going to meet Neptune again exact, but he's getting a little bit closer to him, where Neptune's at 23 Pisces and Jupiter's at 29, technically conjunct. So the fog of illusion, confusion, or self-delusion, right now, that a large part of the collective is under becomes exacerbated by the energy that we're also under now, which started around the October 11th Mars in Gemini square to Neptune in Pisces. And this square repeats itself on November 19th and again on March 23rd of 2023. So again, I said this before, but I think hysteria is a good word for this energy. And I think that's easily recognized by the semantics of this time period, which include words such as hoax and fraud and other outright statements that claim things have occurred with no factual evidence to back it up. I think it's popping in my head now, so I'm going to say it, and I mentioned this previously. One of my favorite Shakespeare quotes is from The Tempest, and it is, "Nothing is but what is not." And I don't know, I just love that quote. Anyway, so I think you can take that quote and use it both ways for metaphysical up-leveling and also to identify what is not, Now, in short, the collective unconscious of not only those in the U.S., but of many nations abroad, especially during their different election seasons, some of which have been occurring recently. As I mentioned, Israel, there's also Venezuela, there was Italy, which elected its first, I don't know if it's its first woman, but, she was has roots with neo-Nazi groups. And that these elections the people voting in these elections have had their psyches kidnapped and now held for ransom. So waking up is going to be difficult. And we know on the domestic front here in the U.S., that the fate of U.S. democracy stands in the balance. I do not think this is an overstatement, as anyone who's listened to my previous shows would well know. So as we move toward November 8th, Taurus full moon lunar eclipse, let's remember one thing. It's asking us to release these hidden scorpionic prejudices, hatreds, jealousies, so that we may live in peace and harmony with the equal right to life's resources, pleasures, and comforts without fear of attack because someone wants what you have and decides to disempower you by taking it away from you. And in this case, the real hoax is that certain members of Congress here in the U.S. and others cry liberty, which is a revival of Patrick Henry's Revolutionary War cry, give me liberty or give me death. I believe that's New Hampshire, right? They used to have it. I don't know if they still do it. If any of you are from New Hampshire, used to have it on their license plates. When in fact, the astrology tells us that they're using such verbiage as the hook with which to catch us up. In other words, if we, meaning they, manipulate you to convince you that we're fighting for your freedom, then you'll help us gain power over you so we can manipulate you further to give your personal and collective power to us. And that makes this Taurus full moon lunar eclipse pivotal, as it really, in my opinion, revolves around a recent statement former President Obama made while out campaigning for Democratic candidates when he asked his audience, who will fight for you? Who cares about you? Right? So if we don't care about ourselves and we're not willing to fight for ourselves, how can we find those, as I said earlier in this podcast, who we can trust, who will help aid in waking up our inner warrior, particularly since, I've mentioned this before too, Chiron is in Aries, and therefore, because Aries is ruled by Mars, there's a connection. So Mars movements, retrograde in Gemini, call us to go deep, to figure out our wounds, while this eclipses ask us to go deep to figure out what are our actual prejudices, to employ the help of others who we give the power to fight for us, right? Because they truly care, not because they're in it for themselves and for the power and the money, etc. Now, two other things here. Remember that Pluto ruled Scorpio, and yes, I prefer the modern ruler over that of Mars, and also it gives the connotation of what I was quoting from Liz Green's book, which is outer planets ruling the collective unconscious of not only individuals, but nations as well. That Pluto ruled Scorpio represents archetypally transformation, but that transformation means the end of the old and the birth of something new. It's related to death and rebirth, but when that occurs, what's astrologically known about the Scorpio archetype is that, and this relates to the 8th house as well, because Pluto rules the 8th house in the natural chart, there is no going back. Whatever deed is done becomes irreparable. And that's the crossroads we're at now. So if we diminish the ability to function as a fully democratic state at this upcoming lunar eclipse on midterm election day by voting in those deluded or swayed by visions of empowerment, which, as noted, will ultimately be used against us to disempower, it would be used against, my terminology and the pronouns are confusing me here. So if we vote for those who are deluded or swayed by visions of their own personal empowerment, they will use that against us to disempower or disenfranchise us from the political process in the future. And then, and I can't say this clearly enough, the situation will become irreparable. And think of it in terms of evolution, which Pluto Scorpio represents. Once a species adapts, and it does so to deal with changes to the current environment in order to ensure its own future survival, there is no going back. We don't regain lost limbs in physical form, despite modern science advances, which have been wonderful. But when they're gone, and those who lose them must adapt, as so many courageous humans have done over the years. And Mars retrograde in Gemini is only part of the equation, but what it asks us ultimately to do is to summon that inner warrior, the part of us that knows we have to fight to individuate ourselves from group speak and group think, and avoid the temptation to flow with the expansive Jupiterian and Neptunian tides now, as if we have not a care in the world because someone else will fight the fight for us, which is also, this is another pet peeve of mine, in essence, part of the reason why, I don't know if this is true everywhere, so I can only speak about my experience in the U.S., but in the U.S. we tend to glorify heroes, and that traditionally such heroes who made their way into high office used to be mostly from the military. They were generals, they were admirals, etc. But now, they, over the last 40 years with the election of Ronald Reagan in the early 80s, they hail from the realm of movies, TV, sports, etc. And we vote them into office thinking that they're literally going to save us. So, we have people running the show who often know nothing about politics and the power structure. Now, I'm not saying that that's the most terrible thing, but based on what we experienced during the Trump administration, I don't think we can make an argument for electing more celebrities or famous people just because they're famous. As Bill Maher said recently about the upcoming elections in his interview by Ari Melber on MSNBC, and here I quote, "Once they win, the die is cast." Again, Scorpio archetype means things are irreparable. So again, the message of this current eclipse season is to take responsibility for our own true self-empowerment, which occurs only when we're brave enough to look at our demons and dragons by exposing them to the light. And this eclipse lunation reflects the light of the Scorpio Sun back onto itself, which reveals to us our shadow side nature, or all the creepy, crawly, slimy stuff we've hidden from view and locked out of our consciousness. And only then may we successfully release our deepest, darkest secrets and buried fears, so that in the process we neutralize the unconscious power they hold over us, thus causing others to simply fling the same energies back at us over and over again from outside sources. So all we need to do to verify what I'm saying now is to look around and observe. We can use our ego's orientations, logical and rational natures to see for ourselves now, and especially as soon as Mars stationed retrograde on October 30th, that the use of violent rhetoric burst into violent action to surface in front of our faces. And we're reminded now that rather than lashing out at perceived enemies, we can use our past wounding, both again from early life and past ones, to adjust the course of future healing, as Venus in Scorpio quincunxed wounded healer in Aries yesterday, November 2nd. Likewise, when the Scorpio Sun quincunxes Chiron and Venus opposes Uranus in Taurus November 5th, sudden shocks or upsets in our relationships may trigger old wounds. And if that happens, we have two choices. Be mindful, though, of what I said in terms of the collective and moving into the last final days of this U.S. midterm election. Manipulation. People are going to use whatever shocks or upsets may happen in the collective or have happened in the collective, such as the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, an 82-year-old man, that, the choices we have are that we can add fuel to the fire, because when triggered, we're unable to distinguish between who hurt us and who's here to help. And the sudden reveal of any secrets now, and remember the Sun, Mercury, and Venus are in Scorpio, which represents both, and these are personal planets, so they're more emotional, and they represent all things taboo and all things hidden, may cause a rapid shift in our perspective, which then causes us to make a sudden break from someone or some group with whom we formerly engaged or supported. And along with that rapid shift, We may also shift the blame to others for re-triggering old wounds or seemingly causing new ones. So when that's the case, especially with so much Scorpio energy in the sky, via, again, the eclipses and the Sun, Mercury, and Venus, along with the quincunxes from the signs of Scorpio to Aries. Remember, Pluto rules Scorpio in the modern, Mars rules Aries, always. We may unconsciously lay blame and attempt to seek retribution. Instead, we can use these energies to realize that any old relationship wounds triggered now represent the opportunity for us to tweak our past responses and adjust to present circumstances. Maybe this isn't maybe it isn't our father or mother or first love interest who wounded us. Maybe the appropriate response is not to lash out because we placed blame solely on them. Now, I'm not disputing, cases of assault, sexual assault, of violence, etc. in the past. What I'm saying is that our soul has been conditioned by events that happen to us, events that often we never asked for, right? But astrologically and on the psychological, astrological energy, we carry these energies within. They've been incorporated into our unconscious. And because of that kind of soul conditioning, we may draw to us those who repeat the same actions. We know that responding to them in the same way as, Einstein has said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So we need to shift our perspectives about how we got into certain relationships in the first place, take responsibility for that, and find a mature response rather than one triggered solely by our overly emotional inner child. And as Bill Maher also said recently in that interview, this is not talking about the election and electing these, people who believe in the fraud, that the election was unfair or whatever, or rigged, or all these hoax things, that he said, quote, "This is not the way the country is going to heal itself by listening only to that which it already knows." So as we look at this upcoming Taurus full moon lunar eclipse, which again occurs at 16 degrees of Taurus Scorpio axis with the moon conjoining Uranus, right? So I mentioned here that on November 5th, Venus is going to oppose Uranus, and that this may disrupt our relationships. We may find out something surprising. Something might be revealed. Venus is in Scorpio. Could be about sex, could be about money, could be about betrayal, could be about anything hidden from us by someone or others with whom we're in relationship. And that on November 6th, Mercury likewise quincunxes Chiron. So in the course of this week, we had Venus quincunxing Chiron, we have the Sun quincunxing Chiron on November 5th, and we have Mercury quincunxing Chiron. Hence my remarks about finding a new way to heal rather than continuing to just perpetually blame the same bad players, right? But on the 6th, late on the 6th and early on the 7th, as we're heading towards November 8th's eclipse, we have we have Venus in Scorpio forming a fixed square to Saturn in Aquarius, right? So this is always also about relationship because Venus is relationship oriented. And I think Saturn and Aquarius would fit the bill for where we put our priorities and our values in terms of friends, groups, and associations in the process of individuation. A square is inner tension, and it asks us to look very closely at the quid pro quos of our partnerships. Are we giving more than we're getting? And if so, do we want to walk away? Are we getting more than we're giving? And does the other person want to walk away? So these are going to go hand in hand, some kind of surprise upset, but, very, very possibly related to making decisions after Venus opposes Uranus on the 6th, or is it the 5th? It's on the 5th. and then making decisions based on that, okay? Now on the 8th, the as I said before, the eclipse occurs at 3:02. I think I said 3:01, but I'm looking at my Llewellyn calendar now, which I should have done before, but whatever. At 3 a.m. on the Pacific and 6:02 a.m. on the Eastern time clock, and that's going to be after our time turning back the clocks on Sunday, November 6th, yippee, that the sun will conjoin with Mercury in Scorpio. I would assume, based on the way things are going, that number one, that might have something to do with how many young people are voting, given that Mercury is maybe the secret weapon, but also a lot of these hoaxers and fraud claimers declaring victory on the night of the election, which is a precedent apparently set by Donald Trump in 2020. So be aware of that. But it could also be some announcements from heads of state like President Biden or others. And Mercury will then follow in Venus's and the Sun's footsteps and oppose Uranus on, I'm sorry, it's not the Sun. Did the Sun? Yeah, Venus's footsteps on the 8th after the eclipse, but it's waxing into the eclipse, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mercury perfects its opposition to Uranus on the 8th, and the Sun perfects its opposition to Uranus on the 9th. Meanwhile, as many of you know, the Moon is teaming up with Uranus to oppose Venus, the Sun, and Mercury. And I mentioned last week, some people may, and I think the relevant part is that the Venus opposite Uranus, that happens a few days before the actual election, may influence us based on what we find out, potentially about betrayal in relationships or partnerships, causes us to say no more, okay? Because Venus squares Saturn. Forgive me. I'm trying to make sure I end on time, and I don't want to get anyone confused. So my point is, as I said last week, the Moon, Uranus, and Taurus. Taurus is usually stable, steady, doesn't want any change. But, along with Uranus and Taurus for the past couple of years, since 2018, we've been looking at a change in value. So the Moon comes up to Uranus and it goes, wait a minute. Oh my God, and I had presented the theory or the hypothesis that you're standing online, or perhaps you're still filling out an absentee ballot to drop off at a ballot box or something, and your daughter says, wait a minute, or your grandfather says, you're not going to do that, are you? Or whatever, and it instantly changes our mind for the moment, but that can be an action or a decision that we later come to regret. The Moon opposite the Sun at a full moon is always the heart and the mind being out of alignment. Okay, Sun Mercury, of course, like I said, is going to be perhaps something that is announced, or perhaps something that persuades us, a responsible authority figure. The Sun is the father figure. It's not exactly like Saturn, but there's some overlap, right? And Venus it may come in a more soft velvet glove, iron fist inside a velvet glove. Well, honey, you know that if you vote that way, right? And it can be used both ways. It can be used for positive or negative depending on your belief system. If your mother sits you down because you're a young man and this is the first time you're voting and talks to you about the rights of women, in a very soft way and a very logical, rational way, perhaps he'll go, oh, yeah, I guess I don't want to vote for that candidate. Oh, he's taking away your rights, Mom. He's taking away my sister's right. He's taking away my cousin's right. I love these people. All right, so it can go either way. And unfortunately, because we don't know which way it's going to go, there's, also waxing during this eclipse is the Venus trine Neptune. So hopefully that brings a little balance and peace and harmony. But what I wanted to say also is that, everybody's on edge. We know this. Even the radio stations, I'm sorry, not radio station. This is a piece from an article as I often find that, as I've already kind of noted, that newscasters, reporters, and pundits tap into the astrological energies because I so often hear in their words echoes of the astrological meaning of current energies in play. And as an example, this is from a recent New York Times piece, and quote, amid rampant distrust in the news media and a rash of candidates who have telegraphed that they may claim election fraud if they lose, news anchors and executives are seeking new ways to tackle the attacks on the democratic process that have infected politics since the last election night broadcast in 2020. For entrepreneurs of chaos, making untrue claims about the election system is a route to greater glory, said John Dickerson, the chief political analyst at CBS News, who will co-anchor the network's coverage on November 8th. He continues, elections and the American experiment exist basically on faith in the system, and if people don't have any faith in the system, they may decide to take things into their own hands. And I want to end with just saying that, Ari Melber also said recently, and I'm paraphrasing, is that, and I relate this to Mars and Gemini in general, but also retrograde, violence masquerading as a way to communicate, right? Which violence is always going to make people fearful. And that, of course, relates to another, the economy and then violence, crime are two of the big things that one side is pushing while the other is talking about the future of democracy. So what I have to say now is that we want to make sure that Mars and Gemini's mutability doesn't make us suddenly change our opinion in a way that might come back to haunt us later. So I just want people to keep that uppermost in their minds. Think about it and steady yourself. Now, if we can manage to keep our eye on the prize, which is long-term Jupiterian strategy over short-term tactics, to which Gemini and impatient Gemini, with Mars and Gemini, is prone, we stand a better chance of holding on to our democratic foundation. As Democratic Michigan Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin reminded her audience at a recent campaign event while discussing the importance of kitchen table issues such as crime and inflation and the economy, quote, the kitchen table represents our issues, but our democracy is the home in which that table sits. And Liz Cheney, who now, of course, has flipped Venus, I keep saying it the wrong way, I'm sorry. Venus opposite Uranus, coming early a little bit for her. I don't know. Some of us are more sensitive to energies earlier. I know I am sometimes, depending on what they are. She said she's now thrown her lot behind several. I think the big one was J.D. Vance, against J.D. Vance in Wisconsin, and for the Democratic Senate candidate. She said, we have to walk away from business as usual. And that's part of my reference to individuation earlier in the show and not getting caught up in the hysteria of collective unconsciousness. And, I relate that to Saturn because it's the old guard. Cheney is clearly part of the old GOP guard, advocating actually not sticking to tradition, but rather doing something new and potentially progressive. So there's hope. And I am now over my time, so I'm going to thank everyone for joining me today and say that I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week on November 10th. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book